Hello, we welcome you all to another episode of the Cosmic Matrix Podcast with your hosts, my wife Laura Matsu and myself, Bernhard Günther. And the topic of this one is Unveiling the Psyche, Subpersonalities and Invisible Influences on the Mind. It's a very, very important topic, especially this day and age with everything that's going on in the world in the context of the inner work and outer work. Because as I've always said and written about for many years, the spiritual war is actually through us, and the matrix also works through us. So we really need to understand these forces that are affecting us and the different parts of ourselves, and from a psychological and in a spiritual perspective. So in the first hour, we will discuss how the mind is not located in the brain. We will discuss what the psyche is in relationship to the Jungian model. We'll also talk about Sheldrake's concept of the morphogenic field in the environmental consciousness, how this ties also into different energy fields in the yoga philosophy, and how our mind is affected by these fields in various ways, various forces, cosmic forces, natural forces that influence us and all our actions, thoughts, sensations, and behaviors. And also especially the influences of various subpersonalities, because we all have all kinds of different personality parts we most often mistake for the true self. And obviously there are also influences from the spiritual field. We will then also discuss how to work with these fields within yourself, the porosity of mind, and the various forces then in general affecting our mind, and to differentiate them. And in the second hour, we will go much deeper into the spiritual and occult field arena and how we're influenced by spirits, entities, and various occult forces. We will address the skepticism around spirit attachments, some arguments people make why they believe this is just part of our psyche, or they don't really exist and there's no proof of it. So we address those as well. And we also talk about how we can actually perceive these beings directly. We'll be discussing how mental illness relates to spirit attachments, the difference between a spiritual psychosis and spiritual initiation. And most importantly, we will also talk about how to differentiate between subpersonalities and spirit attachments. I mean, basically separating between what is mine and what is not mine, and other important considerations about this topic. Now, before we start, a little announcement. We are starting enrollment for another round of our 14-week private online group coaching program, Embodied Soul Awakening, where we dive deeper into psychological and spiritual self-work to embody your true self, really combining the inner work based on the fourfold approach in the context of the outer work, the bigger picture in the context of the evolution of consciousness. It's a very powerful program. We've done already 14 times. This is round 15. It always fills up before we start. As a matter of fact, it's already halfway full right now, but there's still space. It's by application only, limited to 35 people, and you can find out more about it and then apply at the website thetimeoftransition.com. So go to thetimeoftransition.com to find out more about it. There's also more information in the application form with different options.
And I just want to add something. The reason that we like to work with smaller groups is because it allows for a more intimate experience. It's not just like us talking to like 100 people in a giant class. Like, we really give a lot of personal support and attention to people. And also, it's really about the group experience and an intimate group experience with other people. And it can be very healing, especially for those people who do a lot of inner work on their own, or looking to find community, or looking to find people to talk to. So, I was reflecting on that the other day, like, why does the smaller group feel so good? Is because it becomes almost this container of itself. And, the few times we've done larger master classes, we have very little time for any individual attention. Maybe we can answer like one question from someone if they're lucky. Whereas here, it's really a dynamic experience of the group all going through on the soul journey together. And it's really very interesting how each group has a different energy and dynamic. There have been people who have met like lifelong friends from our groups who they're still in contact with now. So it's really just beautiful to see what comes out of the group, even beyond the time that we work with people, and the almost like karmic connections and soul connections which are made are really beautiful to witness.
Always the right people join the right makes interesting. Even still, the first group we did 4 or 5 years ago, they still meet up on a regular basis.
I know. Met in person, and it's
awesome.
It's really cool. Yeah. Okay.
Perfect. So let's dive into it. Unveiling the psyche, subpersonalities, and invisible influences on the mind. So speaking of the mind and everything, let's start with a certain assumption or the worldview we currently have. Most of us, or most of ourselves, our view of ourselves and others and the world as a whole is more or less shaped by the assumption that we are an independent person and separate from everything and everyone else. Many of us also tend to assume that the mind is just located in the brain, enclosed like a fortress, existing independently of other people's minds and the external physical world. We tend to assume that everyone has their own mind bubble, that we alone are the creators of our thoughts, and that they are generated from signals between neurons inside the brain. That's literally the conventional scientific view. But that idea that the brain is the organ of the mind is based on a materialistic view of reality and ourselves as perceived by our 5 senses. We live in a materialistic age, and the opinions of mainstream, or the whole view of mainstream consensus science and medicine, are based on the physical perception of reality, and they don't acknowledge a spiritual reality because you cannot quote-unquote prove it, which we'll talk about as well. However, humanity was not always so disconnected from the spiritual world as we are now. And the split between spirituality and materialism has actually exponentially increased since the dawn of the, quote, Age of Enlightenment, also called the Age of Reason in the 17th century. By the way, I also think that's in Rudolf Steiner's view also when Ahriman, the
spirit of materialism.
The spirit of materialism came, and took humans over, so to speak.
Yeah, because even if you bring up the idea of spiritual influences, or, the other day I saw someone saying that everything is just part of your psyche, everything is just part of your own personal unconscious, basically, and there are no such thing as independent spirits. That is a view rooted in materialism, and they don't realize it.
Exactly, yeah. As if the human
because it's so pervasive. I think that's the whole thing. Is like, I actually, over a decade ago, no, that's not true. I always believed in spirits as a child. I always believed in ghosts. I don't know if anyone would watch Unsolved Mysteries. I used to watch that a lot, and I was obsessed with it. I always knew that ghosts were real. However, through the process of growing up, through culture, through the conditioning, you start to learn through the through the dominant worldview and philosophy of materialism that these things are not real, actually. They're just, woo-woo stuff, or just stuff not to look into. So even with myself, through my own spiritual journey, I had to overcome some of my own conditioning. Even though I knew as a child they were real, I was even luckily told by my parents they were real, but even that was not enough, because the worldview of materialism is so dominant that if you say, hey, I saw a ghost, 99% of people will look at you like you're crazy. Yeah. So we have to really understand that when we come against blockages around this, are they our own, or are they a product of this dominant worldview and what other people in the consensus think of it? Well,
the irony, we will talk about this because it ties into the environmental consciousness and having taken on beliefs and ideas from the consensus that are not our quote-unquote own.
Exactly.
But also on top of it, humans have also become more mentalized, meaning they're not only disconnected from the spiritual realm, but also dissociated and disconnected from the bodies. Most people are living exclusively in the head. And with the dawn of transhumanism, AI, we talked about this, and also the exponential increase of technology, it keeps humans even more externally focused and stuck in their heads, to the detriment of the inner lives and soul beings. But literally, that's actually the matrix trap in itself, the disembodiment, the dissociation, the mentalization, and all of that, which creates all kinds of entry points for other forces to come in, because the war is ultimately through us. I've said this many times before. Ultimately, the sense of an independent identity and person separate from and impenetrable from everything else is the greatest illusion and spell we have fallen under. The truth is ultimately that our mind is porous and permeable. We are transducers of cosmic, universal, and environmental forces, and we are influenced by conscious, non-physical, spiritual beings that are not part of our shadow or psyche of the higher and lower realms, elementals, nature spirit, and the unseen forces of nature. So it's a whole vast reality out there on unseen levels that we are influenced by. Now, before we start into like really understanding what the psyche is from different perspective, I want to share a little fun fact I came across recently. And it goes, there are only 5,000 psychotherapists in India, about 5,000 psychotherapists in India for 1 billion people, right? I'm sure there are way more psychotherapists in the US for, I don't know, 250 million people. But in India, they get better results in psychotic episodes than we in the US because they have a different conception of mind and consider a spiritual reality and other beings.
I mean, the essential foundation of religion in India is Hinduism, which acknowledges, and along with many Eastern traditions, that these spiritual forces exist and they also develop a conscious relationship with them. So it's basically embedded in the fundamental worldview of a lot of places in the East that these spirits exist. And that's the difference between the East and more Western influenced cultures who are more dominated by materialism. So it's very interesting. Like, we have to understand that we're also in a little bit of a bubble when we grow up in a Western world, detached from these other cultures that acknowledge these spiritual beings, and the belief in these spiritual beings is actually the dominant worldview. Our worldview, we just think is the best, and there because it's so influential. So we think it's the perfect one. So, but yeah, let's talk about what is the psyche. So the word psyche has Latin and Greek roots. It can mean soul, mind, spirit, life, the invisible animating principle or entity which occupies and directs the physical body, and the mind as the seat of thought, faculty of reason. So psyche, when I refer to psyche, I mean soul, and I'm referring to the mental, psychological, and emotional component of the soul. And we'll talk about how that plays out on different levels of consciousness. So let's also cover what the common dominant materialistic worldview of the psyche is, which is more inspired by Freudian psychoanalytic theory, which is the psyche is comprised of the id, which I'll describe in a moment, the ego, and the superego, and has both conscious and unconscious components. So the ego is the adult, the rational part of our mind. You can think of the id as the instinctual, childish, spontaneous part of our mind, while the superego is the voice of, I mean, it's not quite the voice of conscience, but you could refer to it as a voice of conscience insofar as it's influenced by our parents, people of authority. It's the voice of telling us you should do this is right, this is wrong, etc. So the ego is meant to be between the balance of the ego is meant to maintain a balance between the instinctual drives of the id and the instincts, which just like a child just wants what it wants, and the voice of the superego, which tells us what we should do. And this can go wrong in a variety of ways. So basically, if we identify with a superego, the voice of like what you should do, we can become very judgmental and harsh on ourselves and others. We become very rigid. We become very holier than thou. We become very judgmental of creative, spontaneous, instinctual people. We become very judgmental of the id, basically. And on the other side, we can also become very detached from the superego and live in like a childlike fantasy world, like kind of like Peter Pan syndrome, where we never want to grow up or take responsibility for our lives. We become very developmentally stunted at a certain age. So the whole point of Freud's model is to have a balance. And I want to point out that there's a lot of truth in that, actually. I see a lot of people, like, let's take even this whole kind of dogmatic conservative right movement. To me, their ego is all totally identifying with the superego on what is right, what people should do, right?
The self-righteousness.
Yes, the self-righteousness, the judgmentalness. Whereas, you have on the other side, actually, of the coin, the more new age people who are like, everything that, whatever you think of is real. If you believe that you're Jesus, it's a reality. Like, anything they kind of live in this kind of fantasy bubble, detached from the outer world, detached from the voice of conscience, the voice of reason. So there's a problem with over-identifying with either side. And I just want to point out there is a profound truth in it, But basically, Jung went deeper in it. And the whole point in Freud's psychoanalytical theory of the personality is to develop ego strength, which is the ability of the ego to deal effectively with the demands, wants, wishes of the id, that childish part, and the superego and reality. So, we want to have enough ego strength so that we're not either unwielding or rigid or childish and disconnected from reality. And ego strength basically translates to emotional stability and the ability to cope with internal and external stress. So for example, like say there's a part of you that like really wants to, let me think of something. Say there's a part of you that's say you're in a relationship and you're very attracted to someone. That's the id, right? That's the childish part. But like, I want this, right? But I'm in a relationship with someone. That would be the super ego coming in. And then the ego, which would be your voice, like your kind of reality checker. You'd be like, okay, I'm attracted to someone, but I'm loving with this relationship with, and you kind of mediate those wants and needs with the voice of conscience, right? Whereas if you are totally identified with the super ego, you would just shame yourself for even having those thoughts to begin with. So there's a lot of truth in it. But then Jung went deeper.
Just want to note real quick, Freud, because that's important to note, because Freud has got a bad rap. There's definitely limitations of Freud. He had his own issues. It's very limited, but it's not black and white. And his model, like you just mentioned, of the id, ego, and the super ego is important to keep in mind. It's a very limited level of understanding the psyche, but very valuable as well.
Yeah, he was also a materialist, and he was mainly an atheist. Exactly. So that's the limitations of it. And then Jung, the more he started diving into the mysticism and started departing from Freud, he even in his early studies, he was actually studying mediums and people who connected with spirits directly. So he went off into a whole other arena, right? And so Jung refers to the psyche as a totality of all psychic processes, conscious and unconscious. And he also has this map of the psyche where the self was the center of it. And the self was a self-regulating system of the psyche, which strives to maintain the balance between opposing qualities, while at the same time seeking its own unique development, which he called individuation. So Jung's model of the psyche is like a central organizing factor of our consciousness. He saw it as an image of the mandala. So when you look at a mandala, he saw this as encompassing the psyche, which has various different parts that all unify in a comprehensive center. Mm-hmm. And then Jung's model of the psyche has different components. So he had the ego, he also had the persona, the self, the shadow, the anima animus. So those are the kind of main, I guess you could say, characters in his model of the psyche. And he also said that there's a personal unconscious component of the psyche, along with a collective unconscious, which is where the archetypal realm lies in within it. So within the personal unconscious, there are complexes, which in IFS they would refer to as parts, which are basically clusters of intense feelings, behaviors that are filled with thoughts, memories around certain themes. So we all have a complex, a mother complex, for example, and a father complex. And these are created and constellated around our experiences of our mother, women in our life, nurturing figures in our life, and father, authority figures in our life, and, various male figures, essentially. And the mother and father complex is like one that we all have, basically.
And this complex, we'll talk about this later, but it can be then related to parts.
Yes, that's what I would say. Yes, exactly. That's what I said. Yeah, exactly. So when we're talking about parts, Jung would most likely refer to, or the Jungians would most likely refer to this as a complex or a subpersonality. And he also saw the realm. This is where he entirely departs from Freud, because he also saw a spiritual realm, which he called the collective unconscious, which are filled with archetypal forces and images and symbols, which are eternal within all of mankind. So, like, the cross is a symbol in the archetypal unconscious. The tree of life is a symbol in the archetypal unconscious. Like, any archetypes can be anything from significant events like birth, marriage, death, falling in love, war. They can be characters like the hero, the old man, the child, the queen, the king, the mother, father, etc. They can be symbols as well. Like I said, the crucifixion, mandalas, Or it can be like significant like moments in life, like when you go through an initiation or adolescence, midlife crisis, abandonment, all of these, like it's any kind of symbol which shows itself eternally through time, which basically belongs to the collective realm, essentially. And these arise when needed, but they do not exist in the psyche, but exist in a pre-existing state. Meaning, at significant moments in your life, you make contact with an archetype. Like when you get married, you get contact with an archetype, but it actually belongs to the collective realm and not in your psyche. And I also want to point out, even though this has been I've a little bit debated within Jungians, is that from my understanding that Jung actually believed that the archetypes were independent psychic entities, meaning they do not just exist as a product of your own psyche, they are independent beings. So when we're referring to entities or spiritual forces or whatever, these are essentially most likely archetypes in the archetypal realm, which have their own independent existence outside of the psyche, meaning you can make contact with them with the psyche. It is very dangerous to identify with these archetypes, which Jung agreed with, same as it's dangerous to identify with Jesus or Satan, but these have its own independent psychic existence, basically. Yes. And I even see some Jungians who do not actually acknowledge that. So I just want to say that that's our perspective and that's our point of view that we're going to be addressing this issue from that. But there's also a lot of Jungians who are more into the materialistic side of Jung's theories, and they don't actually acknowledge that they are independent beings in themselves.
Yeah, and there's these psychic forces influence humanity at large and work through us and manifest in everything based on equilibrium, the tension of opposites. So that ties into, we have talked about this many times before, the process of individuation, whole purpose of shadow work. The more denser the shadow is on the personal and collective level, the more the outside quote unquote world needs to enact it. And that's what we see happening right now in the forms of wars, chaos, and struggle, because we are not as soul embodied. We don't heal the opposites, or we don't hold the tension of opposites within ourselves, as even Carl Jung said.
And I would say, to put it simply, as that we are more and more becoming externally focused and not becoming internally focused.
Yes, exactly.
Meaning we don't look within, we don't self-reflect. I know I've worked with many people who can't even tell me what they're feeling, and what the emotions like. So we've really gone a long way. And even, I even think of some people, I knew this person whose parents fell asleep with the TV on. And so usually the only time that we actually make contact with the inner world is through dreams, meaning if we're not self-reflecting in our waking life, the dreams will actually show us what's going on in this inner world, right? But some people are so externally focused that even then they try and drown out the dream life. So it's very fascinating how disconnected we get from that part of ourselves.
Yeah, and just close off that section with a very brilliant quote by Carl Jung. He says, instead of being at the mercy of wild beasts, earthquakes, landslides, even wars and inundation, modern man is battered by the elemental forces of his own psyche. This is the world power that vastly exceeds all other powers on earth. The age of enlightenment, which stripped nature and human institutions of gods, overlooked the god of terror who dwells in the human soul. And he also says that the totality of the psyche can never be grasped by the intellect alone. Very important. Because it, like Laura just mentioned, it also reveals itself in the language of symbolism and dream that go beyond intellectual understanding or even five sensory understanding.
Okay, so first we're going to address this idea, which is popularized, is that the mind is just located in the brain, which is basically the foundation for this idea of mental illness being a biological process, being a chemical imbalance. So this is where we're going to address some theories that completely disagree with that, essentially. So one concept I want to bring in is this concept of morphic genetic fields by biologist Rupert Sheldrake. Interestingly, his talk on morphic genetic fields has been banned on TED Talks. This is not because he was saying anything that was politically incorrect or whatever. It's because the TED Scientific Advisors believes I mean, number one, it throws so much of what other TED Talks are talking about out the window because it's based on materialistic science. But they basically believe there's little evidence for his claims. They don't believe there's any evidence for morphic resonance. He also made a claim that the speed of light is changing. So they recommended that this talk should no longer be distributed without being framed with caution. Basically, it's banned. It's a banned TED Talk. And the reason it was banned because it challenges longstanding views of materialism. And essentially what Rupert Sheldrake was saying, that each living system has its own type of field, and there's also a field of energy to every single thing in the universe. So every human has a field around them. I'm going to say actually later that they have multiple fields. Each animal has a field, and they contain memory. That's the most important part, is you have a field around you which contains memory. And the brain is just a receiver of the information of this field, meaning consciousness, memory, thoughts, do not arise in the brain itself. It arises in the field around us. So the most important thing to understand about these fields is that they hold memory. And they are also subject to the influence of various thought forms, forces, spiritual forces through these different layers of field. So now let's overlap this with the yogic teachings of Patanjali. He also talked about different energy fields. These different energy fields relate also to our past lives and our karma, and they also relate to how spiritual forces influence us. So we have an etheric field or a vital field. This is the closest to our body, and it carries physical imprints from past lives. So injury, sickness, body pain, birthmarks. These fields carry what Chinese medicine also calls the meridians, which are closest to the physical body. So the Chinese medicine meridian theory is based off of this etheric or vital field. So when we have certain aches and pains or illnesses or injuries from past lives, they can carry over into the next lifetimes through the influence of this etheric or vital field, which is very fascinating to unpack. So I've studied a guy named Robert Woolger who goes into past lives, and he was a Jungian. And he even talks about how people have certain back pain or neck pain because it's connected to this etheric field carrying over from a past lifetime. Very fascinating. So that's the closest to our body. And then the next closest to our body is the emotional field, also known as the astral body, which carries emotional memories from past lifetimes. So if you carried like deep fear or anger or guilt or shame from a past life, this can replay in your current life because you are being affected by the energy imprinted in your astral field. And then it just translates through the brain, through the body, affects the emotions. And this is basically your aura that extends a few feet around your body. It also affects you attracting like circumstances to past lifetimes. So if you have like a strong imprint of like guilt in your field, you may also attract experiences of people like, either blaming you for things or like you attract like circumstances based on what's in your field. And this emotional field could be related to an evolutionary astrology, the archetype of Pluto, which we're not going to go into in depth in this podcast. We talk about another podcast. We talk about it in depth in the course. But Pluto is the psychological and emotional component of deep memories we hold from past lifetimes that were imprinted onto us. And then we have the mental field. So this is the mental body. This field relates to all of our obsessive thoughts, deeply embedded core beliefs like I can't trust people, something is wrong with me, I'm a bad person, I'm evil, I'm not worthy of love, etc. So it's a mental field around us. And this is related to the archetype of Uranus in evolutionary astrology. So this Uranus relates to the mental field that we carry over from past lifetimes. These are deeply embedded core beliefs that get stuck in our field, our soul field, I guess you could call it, on a mental level as a result of difficult or traumatic experiences, and then become the underlying mental filters that we see the world through in this lifetime. And then lastly, we have the spiritual field or the causal body. In Jungian terms, this belongs to the collective unconscious, meaning this is beyond your own individual consciousness, but this is where outside forces and spiritual influences can affect the other subtle bodies. So if you have, like, this is a field where spirit attachments, meaning earthbound spirits, can affect us. This is where occult forces and other entities can affect us. This is where we have karmic ties to other people who we're meant to meet in this lifetime, which will then be drawn towards again in this lifetime because of the nature of that field. So this is essentially where also various benevolent or malevolent spiritual forces can affect us and then affect other energy fields. So if you think of this as like a layer, like we have the physical, the emotional, the mental, the spiritual field, all reaching out from our physical body. And these are the things that affect our mind, our thoughts, our thinking, our emotions, our body, etc.
Beautiful. So I want to expand on that. Thank you so much for sharing that. How this ties into environmental consciousness, also from the view of Sri Aurobindo, the mother, and external suggestion we have taken on. And you can also categorize them in collective suggestions of based on where you grew up and the culture and social influences, ancestral, past life, and all of that. Like I have a German imprint, so to speak, based on the German collective psyche, so to speak, that is within me.
Yeah.
Right. In the sense that's part of the identity of who I am, right? I mean, it's nothing I learned. It's just within me.
Yeah.
You know, people would say now there's epigenetics, but it goes beyond it. It's the field actually of it all, right?
Yeah. I would say that there's a field, spiritual field to Germany, which then penetrates your own spiritual field and then affects the other layers.
Best example, little personal story real quick on this side, because most of my life, I never identified as a German or flag. This whole identification, I never could relate to that, you know, and nationalism and all of this kind of stuff. However, in my process, I had to acknowledge that I was always dealing with some sort of guilt. And I realized in my inner process that I had also the unconscious German shadow of their collective guilt of whatever was projected on them, whatever they've been suppressing since World War II and all of that I had this within myself as well.
Can I say something about that though?
Yeah.
This is just my own personal theory based on working in evolutionary astrology with people in the groups, is that I think that there's a correlation between what you hold in your emotional and mental field and the lifetime and situation that you incarnate into. So you could have had something around guilt imprinted into you in previous lifetimes, which then attracts you to a situation which is like that. That's what I'm trying to explain with the morphogenic fields. That's what I think is happening.
That brings karma to a whole nother level.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
Really understanding that we attracted to certain fields based on our past life karmic setup.
It's all happening on this soul level, and like that's almost like how you know, this whole idea of like it all being separate. Oh, there's your ancestral and then blah, blah, blah. No. It all connects under underlying themes related to what's imprinted into our fields. Yeah. And that's what attracts us to like circumstances.
Exactly. And then also, it's very obvious, but with who we think we are, who, you know, as I always like to say, the know thyself, to really examine, you also realize that your personality you identify with is mostly made up of these biological drives, memories, unconscious stuff that form your desires, drives, and all of that, most often in a very mechanical manner where there's not much free will, and you're more conditioned and programmed in many ways with beliefs, ideas, and thoughts you mistake for your own. But these influences come from your parents, your family, also the people you surround yourself. Not just the conscious influence of your parents, for example, that you picked up unconsciously, but also their unexpressed thoughts, desires, beliefs, and emotions, even their unacknowledged shadow, you have taken on from your parents as well. That's, by the way, it's so important to do this work as parents as well, so you don't give to your children what you have not processed yourself, because what children pick up upon is not just how they're being treated and what happened to them, but all the stuff that has been suppressed, unexpressed as well.
Well, yeah, they're affected
through the shadow.
They're affected by the field of the parents.
The field of the parents, exactly. And then obviously also the shadow, as I mentioned, a shadow and processed trauma we can take on from our family and ancestral line as well. That's why also we have the potential to heal our family and ancestral line if we engage in this work to stop the madness from going on and creating these psychic epidemics, as Carl Jung was talking about. Very important as well. We also carry within us the energetic imprint, or the field, as you say, in history of any place you have lived or currently live. of a city and country. This is also important to understand. Each place on Earth has a certain level of consciousness, a certain history. We are affected by the environmental consciousness. We actually have a whole podcast episode a few years about how spaces and places affect us, especially where we've grown up or where we currently live. We are also constantly influenced because of the mind is porous and permeable. We are influenced by the constant stream of thoughts and feelings people you're surrounded by, right? Especially in dense, when you live in dense cities, especially in crowds, people who are more sensitive, you can feel most often what other people feel and think, and it's sometimes hard to differentiate what is what. But even if you're not aware of, people who are very maybe dissociated and not very sensitive, they are still influenced by it and then mistake certain thoughts and ideas or even their desires for their own, but they have been influenced externally, so to speak, by external suggestions through the field of others.
Yeah, I would say that there's just levels of, I don't think it's possible to become fully aware of all these fields. In fact, I think you would be very overwhelmed if you were. So it's possible to gain more consciousness and awareness of these influences. But for most people, they're actually identified with the contents of these influences. And that's why they're so confused. And that's why they don't know themselves, is because they're not able to differentiate.
Exactly. And I think that the key point is, we'll talk about this later, then your true self essence, the more you're living from that, the less you're unconsciously influenced from this other field, in the sense.
I don't know. I wonder about that sometimes.
Well, we need to define what the self is. But what I would say, then the more in the process,
you're not identified with them.
The process of individuation. That's what I'm talking about.
But I would argue these psychological, mental, and even physical fields still affect us because they hold karma and memory, and they hold essential, almost like guidance or lessons. I guess you could say.
But that ties into what we talk about, that the ego, as long as we are identified with the ego, the personality. We live under the illusion of free will because we are, from the higher perspective, ultimately transducers of higher forces, which we can, in Sri Aurobindo's view, the more soul essence we have embodied, the more we're connected to self, the more we can actually choose what we draw upon, what influence, and ultimately align with divine will.
Yeah, I mean, individuation is also a deconditioning process of all these aspects of our cultural, societal, familial condition, which doesn't relate to who we really are and our unfolding destiny. So an individuation is a stripping off of all the unnecessary influences.
Exactly. But for the most part, people also, we've talked about this before, very driven or influenced or possessed by egregores. And these are kind of group hive mind entities. In esotericism, the term egregore is used to, basically it's a group mind or a collective consciousness, that have taken on certain beliefs, and you see this all over the political spectrum.
Mass psychosis.
Mass psychosis, where Tico ties into that as well. And then we have also our own thought creations, right, that have become entity themselves, that feed upon, that hunt us, unconsciously, so haunt us unconsciously, feeding through us because of our compulsory behavior and compulsive way of thinking and feeling. We create certain elemental energies, entities, thought forms, that kind of feed then upon itself.
But we can also create positive and negative ones.
Correct, exactly. Kind of helpful ones as well.
And I also want to say, touching on what we talked about earlier, your field is also affected by your present thoughts, emotions, psychological and emotional states. So not only is it an existing field within you that affects your states, you can also affect your field through a product of your own self-observation and inner work, and then you change literally the aura of your field.
Yes, that's the true meaning to reality creation, the true meaning how to change the world to make this world a better place. Because just as we are affected by all the unconsciousness of people surrounding us, places, groups, and all of that, we have a positive effect on others the more we come in tune with our soul essence.
Yes.
Right? And higher truths and higher capabilities, we have a positive effect on the field.
And work through some of the limiting aspects and destructive aspects and emotions and thoughts that are held within our field as a product of our own past karma too.
Yes. So these are the external influence and environmental consciousness, or the morphogenic field, what Laura just talked about, on various different levels. But then there's even more. So we talked about this I, we think, who we think we are. When we talk about I, like a lot of people like, well, I think a part of me thinks this way, but another part thinks that. Well, part of me wants this, the other part wants that. Many people, when we talk like this, we already acknowledge that we have different parts within ourselves. We don't realize these are literally different personality within ourselves that are not our true self, but sub-personalities. And even all the esoteric traditions I've talked about, even Gurdjieff, here's a quote from Gurdjieff from over 100 years ago from In Search of the Miraculous. He says, man has no individual I, but there are instead hundreds and thousands of separate small I's, very often entirely unknown to one another, never coming into contact, or on the contrary, hostile to each other, mutually exclusive and incompatible. Each minute, each moment, man is saying or thinking I, and in each time his I is different. Just now it was a thought, now it is a desire, now a sensation, now another thought, and so endlessly. Man is a plurality. Man's name is legion.
But he also did differentiate to a real I, am I not?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So he just said there's an individual I, and then he goes on to say then the ultimate work of esoteric, inner work of any spiritual work is to embody the real I, bring the real I forth, the true self.
Yeah, which is more a witness observer, not someone identifying with the contents of the mind.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and that's really what the work we're here to do, because I see so many people, even within ourselves, when we say, I want this, I want that, we never question what I is in charge, what I is asking, because that's the ultimate question. Who am I? Know thyself.
So the real I is a self-aware observer within you who notices all these parts.
Exactly.
They would call it the self in IFS.
Yeah. And also that's then your connection to the divine, your ultimate, where divine will act uniquely through you.
Yes.
And that's when you connect to that true I self, then you have true free will, then you have access to a tremendous amount of creativity. And you're not living in mechanical life, or like Gurdjieff said, become like a machine where you just mechanically react on your conditioning, programming, or influences from unseen forces.
Yeah. So how can we work with these fields practically? What are some essential tools? I mean, as with any inner work, it begins with self-observation, the ability to notice what you're feeling, what you're thinking, what physical sensations you're feeling, inquiring what that's about, inquiring about their origin. So like when you have an anxiety come up, do you even know you're feeling anxiety to begin with? Like most of the time people will just be like, okay, like they'll just be in their anxiety. They'll try and suppress it. That's the most common thing, is just having the feeling and then immediately try and suppress it through escaping into the head. So this is already going to draw you inwards. And then, there's essential tools that I think are really important to learn, because these become the tools in your toolbox. So when you have a feeling come up, or a certain thought, or a series of thoughts, you can differentiate like what it is and how to work with it. So, one of them is number one, having an understanding of shadow work, because uncomfortable feelings like anxiety, disgust, discomfort, are often related to being in contact with something that's a shadow part. So if you can inquire, what is this about? What am I thinking? What am I feeling? What am I afraid of? Is there a part here that I would be worried if other people saw it within me? I would be horrified. Is there a use to this part of me? Meaning like it maybe has a positive function that you're denying, right? So you have to have certain ways of working through, or even telling, or just kind of poking within your psyche to see where it's coming from. Another thing is understanding subpersonalities or parts. So we'll go into this more in the second hour, but essentially, parts, or what they would call in Jungian psychology, complexes, have their own feelings, thoughts, emotions. Sometimes they even have certain images that go along with them as well. And if you know these certain parts, if you have like a voice inside you that's just like beating you up for like a mistake you made and just like coming down on you, like that is an inner critic part. So do you know what to do with that? Do you know how to objectively observe it without falling under the influence, meaning completely identifying with it, or just letting it shame you into oblivion? So already in doing these self-inquiry exercises, you're gaining access to the true self-consciousness, because who is the one that's observing it all? It's the self. But the moment that you identify with it is the moment that you actually feel much worse, which is why ultimately inner work, even though it's hard at first, or it can seem hard at first, it can seem overwhelming, it will help you deal with yourself in a way that you'll feel more centered, calm. Like it will help you deal with these uncomfortable emotions.
And the key point in all of that, like you mentioned, the prerequisite is establishing the observer. Even Gurdjieff and many others said, before even trying to change anything, just observe yourself, being able to become aware.
Yeah.
Right. And the more you have access to this impartial witness, the self, the more everything becomes clear, the easier you will be able to differentiate.
Which people are terrified of these days. Like there's a reason why we stay glued to our screens for hours a day. There's a reason why people just don't want to close their eyes and be with their own thoughts in meditation for even a few minutes. It drives them crazy because it introduces them to the inner world, which they've most likely neglected for a very long time. So the more that you neglect it, the more a backlog of material is there when you finally approach it. But it's like almost like cleaning out an attic, right? Like in the beginning, it seems really chaotic and messy and oh my God, there's so much going on. I don't even know where to start. But the more that you learn how to observe, deal with these parts, let go of them, then ultimately the more it becomes more clear and it becomes easier with time. So, looking at your conditioning, looking at everything and noticing how it influences you is also really important practice to engage in. So as you share, there's so many different ways we're influenced from people, from media we read, from our environment. And ultimately, the individuation process has a lot to do with deconditioning ourselves of these influences so that we can find our true self, so that we can find our own specific soul nature. And that is also what guides us on our destiny. People want to know, what is my purpose? What am I here to do? Only you can discover that by discovering who you truly really are. No one else can tell you, and unfortunately. Maybe they can give you certain hints or mirror stuff, but unless you realize that within yourself, it will not work. It will not last very long because that true self is meant to be the guiding factor towards your destiny. Yeah. And I would also say, paying attention to your inner world is not just your waking thoughts and awareness. It's your imagination, your dreams, so engaging in shadow work, healing trauma is really important, but just in general, just paying attention, the self-observation is the background to everything. Evolutionary astrology is a great map for understanding the psychological and emotional fields. We go into that in the program, at least a group program. But the main point I'm trying to make is you can't become more aware of these fields without being willing to look within with a curious and open mind. So you need to be willing to become an in-depth explorer of your psyche, completely comfortable with navigating all emotional ranges and everything that's in your emotional world, and be curious how it's trying to speak to you and the messages it has for you. And most people distract and hide themselves from their inner world and focus mainly externally. So they blame people, they blame the government, they blame billionaires, they blame social media, whatever. It's always something out there, which is the reason to blame for why they are. And partially they're right. It is influencing them in some way. But you need to become more aware and become willing to know yourself on a deeper level. And that's actually how you become truly soul embodied and connected to your soul. Excellent. So in the second hour, we're going to go more into these spiritual fields in depth. We're going to talk more about IFS, the influence and suggestions from spirits, entities, occult forces. We're going to address the skepticisms about spirit attachments, like they don't exist or they're just aspects of your own psyche. We're also going to talk about how mental illness relates to spirit attachments, detrimental effects of psychiatric drugs. We're also going to talk about spiritual psychosis or initiation, meaning there's a danger of identifying with the archetypes, which Jung has talked about. And spiritual psychosis is essentially when people believe that they're Jesus, or, they believe there's some tremendous archetypal figure, or I'm just special. I have special powers. I'm very important. It's this type of inflation that happens and why that happens. And we're also going to talk about how spirit attachments can turn on to full-on possession. And most importantly, how can we begin to perceive these spiritual beings directly? How can we differentiate them from subpersonalities? And anything else I'm missing?
No, that's a lot to dive into absolutely in the second hour. Again, if you're not a member yet and want access to over 130 episodes of our second hour, we go deeper, many stuff we cannot share because we have been censored before, but you can go to my website, veilofreality.com/membership and sign up for the second hour. Get all the access there. And if you're interested in our upcoming Time of Transition Embodied Soul Awakening 14-week program, please go to thetimeoftransition.com, read more about it, fill out the application. There's more, and see you on the other side. Thank you for listening.